Raised on D&D podcast helps enrich your family's gaming experience by bringing you interviews with parents, educators, game designers, and influencers. Join us as we delve into the many ways that tabletop role-playing games inspire creativity, develop communication skills, and create lasting bonds among players. Your host has been an avid gamer since childhood, and now his kids are being raised on D&D. Here's your host, Nick Cardarelli.
Welcome back, gamers. I'm your host, Nick Cardarelli, and this is Raised on D&D. My next guest is from Madison, Wisconsin. You know him from his webcomic and comic book series, Dork Tower. His work has appeared everywhere from New York Times and Rolling Stone to Dragon Magazine. His illustrations have appeared in over 100 games, such as Munchkin and Kobolds Ate My Baby. He is a winner of several Origin Awards and has been nominated for 2 Harveys. He was the first cartoonist to be inducted into the Academy of Adventure Gaming Arts and Design Hall of Fame. He's currently working on a new Dork Tower book. Please welcome John Kovalic. Hi, John.
Hi, how are you?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show, John. We're so excited about the new Dork Tower book coming out, and we're going to talk all about that in just a minute. But for the folks at home who aren't familiar with your legendary work and your origin story, can you take us back to your first experience with tabletop role-playing games and where your love for Dungeons and Dragons really began?
Sure. So I grew up, I was born in Manchester, England, as you can tell from the accent. We moved back to the States when I was 2, then we moved back to England when I was 10. So gaming for me really began about 12 or 13 years old, I would guess, when I got to the school in Somerset, the county of Somerset, England, which is, kind of ironically sort of like the Wisconsin of the United Kingdom. A lot of dairy, a lot of cheese. And in school in England at the time, and probably even more so now, historical miniatures gaming was always a relatively popular hobby, especially compared to, the United States or other countries. And so there were some kids in my school who were pushing around these toy soldiers, Airfix, 1/72 scale plastic soldiers and tanks, which, most of them were painted. And I was always interested in building these Airfix models, these plastic models. So, having a set of rules where you could then play with them afterwards was fantastic. It's like, oh my goodness, who would have thought such a thing existed? And in the UK at the time, you could buy the rules sets for such games in high street stores. And so I started playing historical miniatures games, World War II, in school. And from there, I was in a model shop in Bristol, England, looking for some obscure German tanks. The Hetzer, my great love. And I happened across a game published by the old American company SPI. And this was one of their album games. It was flat. It was in a clamshell, a flat, thin, long, wide clamshell. And the cover of this clamshell was just a huge, great Tiger tank, and the gun is pointed at you, and up in the top right-hand corner is this little blurb saying the time is 4 a.m., December 25th, 1944. And I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to have it. It was just awesome. It fired every neuron in my 14, 15-year-old self in that very excitable little gamer brain of mine. And it was a game called Panzer 44. And it was not a great game, but it was a fine game. And you had to punch out all these little chits, which represented infantry units and tanks. And it was Bastogne, essentially, the Battle of the Bulge. And I loved it so much. And so that got me into board gaming. Although I've got to say, earlier on, before I got into, strictly speaking, what was hobby games, when we moved back to England, there was a game called Escape from Colditz. And this was, again, just a high street game. I don't know who published it at the time, but you could get it alongside Monopoly, well, I don't remember Monopoly being a huge thing in England, but yeah, I guess, but you could buy it in regular stores. And Escape from Colditz has just a couple of years ago was republished by, I'm blanking on the publisher's name, Osprey, I believe. I think their games division republished it, but it was a terrific game. You were a prisoner in a German POW camp, Colditz Castle, and at the time there's a British television series on about these British prisoners of war who would, like, once a week or once every couple of weeks try and escape from Colditz, or just life in a POW camp. So I got this game, and it was so much better than any of the games I'd played in the US before. And, in the US, I've been playing games, those games you get for Christmas, which Kmart would have piles of them, the Happy Days game, the Laverne and Shirley game, and all of these inexpensive board games, which, a couple of them actually were a little clever, but most of them were just, Mousetrap was probably the height of gaming for me before moving back to England. But you get this game, Escape from Colditz, which you had to plan. You had to go around. You had to get equipment to help you escape. One player was the Allies, one or more players. There could be multiple players playing the Allies, and one player was the Germans. And so once you got your wire cutters and rations, I believe, and some other stuff, then you made a break for it. And here's the great thing about that game: the sense of the tension while you were making your escape was palpable, because it wasn't a sure thing, but you had everything you needed. And it was this fantastic feeling of being invested in a game. And so it wasn't until, like, for a couple of years, there was nothing else on the market like that. But then in Bristol, England, I found these SPI games, and everything exploded from that point on. From SPI, I somehow started getting magazines. That's right. Yes, there were these British magazines, because in Britain at the time, and I think still to this day, pretty much every hobby had a full color glossy magazine devoted to it. And Military Modeling was and I believe still is, the magazine if you wanted to paint up Airfix, 1/72, 1 to 32nd or 56. I forget the other scales. 1 to 72nd was my jam, basically. But I remember finding ads in Military Modeling for game stores, which had all of a sudden started appearing around the country. There was one in Bristol, which was relatively close to us. And there was one in London called Games Workshop. Yes. And they had opened their first store, I think it was in 1977. And it must have been there that year. Somehow, it would have been through Military Modeling or some other magazine. I found out about their existence. And London was a 3-hour drive. Wow. But, we would occasionally do day trips to London and just, the family go look at some stuff, because it's not that far, really. And, my parents are American. And so in the US, driving 3 hours is not a big deal.
No.
There's this wonderful line that in America, 100 miles isn't considered a long distance. In Europe, 100 years isn't considered a long time. And so we would do these day trips to London. And I got my parents to stop off in Hammersmith, this outer London West End suburb, where this Games Workshop thing was. And it blew my mind. You had 25 millimeter science fiction miniatures. You had all these dozens and dozens and hundreds of games. And there was this little white box that piqued my interest called Dungeons and Dragons. And it was the small white box, essentially the second printing of Dungeons and Dragons. So this, I had no idea what this was, but somebody at Games Workshop, either Steve Jackson or Ian Livingston, had printed up an explanatory pamphlet, what is role playing? And it came with this little map, and it came with the dialogue. And you see this in so many role-playing games these days, or maybe not so much now because role-playing is so more widely accepted. But certainly in the 80s and 90s, it was almost de rigueur that a new role-playing game had to have this little play, a dialogue with Jimmy DM. Okay. You see a kobold, what do you do? Jane, the wizard, I cast fireball or something. And it'd be the map. But having that map and having that, the dialogue spelled out, immediately I kind of got what this whole thing was about. And it was marvelous. And I loved it so much. And I bought the little white box, which the rules were terribly written. They're just awful. The art was abysmal. But the ideas were literally world-changing and life-changing for me. And as soon as I got back to school, we started playing, my group of friends. I introduced them to the game. I drew up a dungeon, and I got the whole reaction, you're making this up as you go along. It's like, no, here are them, I know, see? And we started a D&D club in Millfield, in Street in Somerset. And it was the most magnificent thing. I loved it. We were doing very rudimentary dungeons, the dungeons that made no sense, dungeons which were essentially a food chain for the monsters, but, they just coexisted and nobody questioned the gelatinous cube that just happened to be strolling, sliming down the hallway or anything, or why there would be goblins living next door to a beholder or anything like that. And from there, I started picking up some fanzines, and my next great role-playing love was Traveller.
Oh, yes.
Traveller came out a little bit later. So I'd gotten the advanced D&D books were being released at the time. So anytime there was a new release, because the first three, what is now known as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition, were not all released at the same time. I think it was the Monster Manual that came first. I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to go back and check. There are going to be people screaming at the podcast right now. I believe the Player's Handbook was second, and then the Dungeon Master's Guide may have been third, but they were released 1 year after the next. And every time there was a new release, I got my parents to drive into London again so we could pick it up. And so I skipped over all of the other box sets, the blue box, the red box, that a lot of people grew up on playing D&D. And I went straight to AD&D. Mm-hmm. It was so great. And to this day, the two things I will do is I will defend to the death Thaco. It may not have been, it may have been ungainly, it may have been unwieldy, but it just made sense. Mm-hmm. And I loved the game. And then again, I went from there to things like Cosmic Encounter, which was relatively new at the time, to Traveller, the RPG, and everything blossomed from there. Then I went to college in London, university. And so I was at the game stores every other weekend, even though it was a hugely long tube journey from Queen Mary College in London's East End to Hammersmith in the West End. But yeah, everything opened up at that point.
That is phenomenal. And John, there's been a lot of games and a lot of mileage between those days and now. But fast forwarding, not only have you made so many amazing games and illustrated even more and had successful web and print comic series, but you're also a husband and a father. Is that right?
Yes, that is.
How many children do you have, John?
Just the one. Just we have no backups. So we got to get it right with this one. My daughter is now 13 years old, And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I stopped publishing the Dork Tower comic book 14 years ago. It was a very high risk pregnancy, and it all came out wonderfully. It was fantastic. She is a great kid. She's fun. She's bright. She's amazing. And but at the time, I needed to spend more time with family because we were driving down to Chicago every couple of weeks to see a specialist in high risk pregnancies. And I was at that point in time, Apples to Apples was huge and getting bigger. Munchkin was starting to get huge. And the one thing I didn't enjoy as much was the business side of producing the comic book.
Yeah.
So I quit doing the comic. But yeah, when my wife and I first met in the early 90s, this is actually it all ties into gaming somehow. When my wife and I first met in the 90s and started dating, I would take her to Star Trek conventions, local Star Trek conventions, just to temper her, kind of like you temper an egg by pouring a little hot water into it first and seeing how that goes, and a little more hot water, and then you can mix it in, or milk, and mix it in to make the custard. So it's like, okay, honey, I love you. What do you think of other geeks?
Now, was she a Trekkie? Is that why?
No,
Trekker? Is that why?
No, it was just a local Trek convention, and I was working at the newspaper at the time, and I got to interview James Doohan. Wow. And so I was going there to get his autograph, but it's like, okay, I'm going to take Judith with me to see how she does in this other part of my life. And she was great. She was a trooper. But then with my gaming group, Magic the Gathering had just come out. Okay. So that she would not, I don't want to say fear gaming, but at the time, you've got to remember the whole, gaming was not a widespread, popular, mainstream activity. There was something slightly tawdry about it. You had the whole Mothers Against Dungeons and Dragons thing and the Satanic Panic of the 80s.
Yeah. We had secret handshakes when we were meeting in basements. So, I mean, it was very clandestine.
It was exactly like the Jack Chick tracks.
Yes.
Exactly. Oh, if only he knew how correctly he pegged us. So I would buy a Magic deck for her and one for me. I would buy a Magic booster for her and one for me. And so because Magic is, at this time especially, it had probably half the rules it does now. It was a very easy game to just pick up and start playing. And Judith came from a family of card players. So, she would know things like Sheep's Head, games like that. And so moving to Magic the Gathering was easy. But she got all the good cards. She got the Thicket Basilisk. She got the Black Lotus.
Wow.
I would get the Plague Rats. I would get the, and I wouldn't even get the swamps. I'd get the mountains because, the swamps, you can do something with Plague Rats. But I did. Yeah. Anyway, so she got the good cards. And eventually she sold her Black Lotus to pay for her wedding dress 3 years later.
Wow. That is incredible.
And there are some people now wincing at that, knowing what a Black Lotus currently goes for.
Yes.
But it's okay, because back then we needed the money more than now. And also that just makes an amazing gaming story, I think.
Yes.
But somewhere in a box in the house, we've got all of our other Magic cards, and I need to find that and go through them at some point in time.
Yes, absolutely. Especially if they're from way back in the beginning of the 90s.
Yeah. A lot of beta cards, a lot of the early releases from those periods.
Now Magic the Gathering has been a stepping stone for a lot of gamers, going from card gaming to tabletop role playing, and especially now since the newest series has combined D&D and Magic, and that was a very recent development.
Yes.
So. Yes. Your wife, Judith, did she ever make the leap from card games to tabletop role-playing games?
Yes. My problem was at the time, it took a long time because Here's the thing. My bad. I introduced her to role playing games with Call of Cthulhu, and that was an oopsie. I could have used Rocky and Bullwinkle. I could have used Top Secret. I could have used Traveler. Could have used D&D. No, I ran a pretty good Call of Cthulhu game back at the time in the day. And the lights would be down, and even my veteran players would on occasion be cowering on the couch. And I ran Call of Cthulhu, a pretty graphic Call of Cthulhu game for my wife with my role-playing group, which had actually, there are other women in the group. So it was, it wasn't like it was just, 6 guys in a dirty basement. But it just scared the heck out of her, and she did not role play again for maybe 20 years.
Wow.
But she got into board gaming. Great. Stuff like Magic the Gathering, which was a very accessible hobby game, and she took that up north to her family, and her and all of her friends loved it so much. And from there, we would play some of the train games. From there, we'd play all these other board games. And eventually, when I started running D&D for my daughter, when she was about 8, Judith and another parent were playing along with. And I ran a game for some of my cousins and their kids back in Western Pennsylvania. And I think that's the point where my wife got back into role playing, and she thoroughly enjoyed it. She loved it because, there's so much humor that comes out in the role playing game. There's a sense of camaraderie. There's this sense of, group storytelling. It's so satisfying on so many different levels. And it was really a terrible decision of mine to use Call of Cthulhu for her first intro to that. It's like, oh, you like movies? You've never been to movies? You should. Let's go to the theater. Let's watch Saw, or right. As opposed to let's watch Casablanca, or let's watch anything. So yes. So now the whole family is role playing, and the whole family has been board gaming for probably, my wife and I have always played board games, things like Carcassonne, that especially is very good for 2 players. But once my daughter started getting to an age where she could enjoy some of the more straightforward card games like Go Nuts for Donuts, there's a game called Dragonwood, which she enjoys a great deal. And she got it mostly because of the art. So, but it's not a bad game. So we would play that a lot. And there's a game called Bad Beats, which is a lovely little game, but it's a bluffing game. In other words, it's a lying game. So it's like, awesome. I just taught my 6-year-old daughter to lie. This is good going, Dad. Major points for that one. But yeah, so we do everything now.
That is phenomenal. How old would you say your daughter was when you did a tabletop role-playing game with her?
I think it would have been 9 years old.
Okay.
We've been doing it for a few years now, so at least 4, possibly 5, when we first did it with all of the cousins and their kids. So there were a bunch of younger kids as well as some of the parents who were my age. And I ran just a little one-off scenario of them over the 4th of July when we were back for this big family reunion, and she loved it. And then all of a sudden she started trying to run it herself in school when she was 9 or 10. And again, this wasn't using rules or anything. This was all just off the top of her head. And then she got some of her friends. I started running over the pandemic Zoom D&D for them, for her and 3 of her friends and 2 of the parents, one of them being Judith. And so we started running Lost Mines of Phandelver, the 5th edition, which is, by the way, a brilliant, by far the best introductory campaign set of scenarios I've ever come across in gaming. It's just this beautiful mini campaign with 3 dungeons, room for so much role playing. It's got a little bit of everything. And I'd run it for my adult group And the kids loved it. But it was funny because the kids were far more direct. My adult group now came from a couples board gaming group we had for a number of years. And when D&D started getting back in the news, a couple of them had expressed interest in it. And so I said, okay, I'll run it. So I picked up Phandelver, and I had 5th edition. And I love 5th edition so much. It's probably the most fun I've had with D&D since 1st edition AD&D.
Wow.
It's how I play. It's very GM light. Again, there's room for many different styles of play in it. But anyway, so the funny thing was the kids were so much more direct than the board gamers were. There's this goblin encounter inside a cave. And I swear my adult players, when they first came across this, essentially had a board meeting on how to deal with these goblins. It's like, just fight them. They're goblins. Just go and fight them. Whereas the kids were like, goblins, we're getting them. Yay. The adults were trying to strategize. Okay, well, do we rescue the knight first? Now if you go from the left-hand side and we go from the right, okay, let's talk this over. So I really put a stop to the metagame table talking after that. It's like, no, you're in the moment here. Just do what comes naturally. But yeah, the kids were very different. And even though the kids have got a harder time keeping the concentration going between sessions, so I found for them, the one-offs work best. And I had to instigate a rule for the kids that you're not allowed to kill members of your own party. In fact, you're not even allowed to attack members of your. We're just not going to do that. Okay, fine, we got that. But once that rule was laid down, it was much easier. They would be very quick to take a sword or a fireball spell to one of their own. It was frankly a little scary. People say children are our future. I don't know if I want to live in that future, frankly. It's these kids were vicious.
And these were friends and cousins of your daughter, right?
This was the ongoing game. These were okay. So for the cousins game, you had the ongoing sibling rivalry problem.
Yes,
with the older girl and the younger girl, and of the same family, and even with their dad playing, this would still be going on. I was, it's like, no, you're sisters. You're supposed to love each other. Don't prepare Bigby's grasping hand because I know how you're going to use it, and it's not going to be pretty. But with my daughter's schoolmates, friends, which was the pandemic ongoing campaign, yeah, they were the ones who the first game they'd be attacking each other almost as much as they were attacking the big bad. So as a DM, I had to put my foot down on that one pretty quick. Well, actually, no, the first game I did not know what to do. By the second game, it's like, okay, new rule. You guys are on the same side. You're not going to attack each other. Okay, we're just laying that out there. That's a house rule, but deal with it. And the games went much smoother then from that point on.
I've got 3 stair steps myself. My youngest is 13 right now, and then I've got a 14 and a 16-year-old, and they in party fighting with that sibling rivalry stacked on top. It can get vicious. It can get vicious. And so yeah, we've had to have some homebrew house rules ourselves, so I totally understand.
My goodness, I was unprepared. I've been DMing for 40 some years. Actually, yeah, it is actually. My gosh, it's going to be close to 45 years. Oh my goodness. Anyway, I'd never encountered anything like it. It's crazy.
Other than the children being straightforward when it comes to objectives in scenarios, was there a time when you expected your daughter and her friends to do something one way and then ended up going in a surprising direction?
I'm sorry. Did I not mention I was DMing D&D? I'm used to that part. Honestly, I am so used to that part. The whole, okay, there's this doorway, this ornate doorway to your left. And well, we're going to go down that wild path over there. Why? Why do you want to go down the wild path? It is obviously unprepared. It is obviously there's this huge ornate doorway with these elven scroll puzzles on it. And it leads to things and it's rich and there's treasure behind it. And we're going to go down that path. There's got to be something there. There has to be something down there because, he's trying to sell this doorway too hard. We're going to go down. It's like, no. So that happens no matter what the age. It's like, you don't, as a dungeon master, you don't want to railroad. You want to have enough of a sandbox going for any eventuality. So what I've done for the kids at this point is I've started designing some scenarios which technically are railroads, but they feel like sandboxes. So they will have the encounters in roughly the same order. And these encounters will happen no matter what path they take. And
yes.
that made life much easier at that point. And I'm sure there've got to be some scenarios that are designed like that out there. But for the kids, for my one-offs, I prefer designing my own. And yeah, so that just made it much easier. And, unless you got a veteran player, most folks are not going to suspect that it's the invisible hand of the DM is pushing you to do this in this order.
That's fantastic. Now, has she gotten behind the DM screen? You mentioned that she was trying to run it when she was 10 without any of the rules at school, and kind of that where her friend group kind of got introduced to it. But has she taken up the mantle of DM yet?
I don't believe so. There's now a D&D club in her school, which they're allowed to take as one of their elective classes.
Wow.
But I know. I believe, though, that it's one of the teachers running that.
Okay.
I don't think, I've seen her flicking through the books. But, what I might do is just push, again, because The Lost Mines is such a great introduction, the rules for that, just designing a first level character are probably much more accessible to a 13-year-old. And she's voraciously devoured. There's Jim Zub and a couple of other folks, his wife, and a third person designed some children's essentially guides to D&D. There's a guide to monsters. There's a guide to classes and races, and they're beautiful little books. And it's bugging me that I don't have the info here just off the top of my head. I
think those are the Young Adventurers guides.
That's it, the Young Adventurers guides.
Thank you. Children love those.
Yes. And I don't know if you can actually run a game with them, but if you can't, that was a missed opportunity because my daughter loves them and they're very well written and they're beautifully illustrated.
Yes.
So, it's all such going back 45 years ago to when I was, I first got that little white book, those 3 booklets. And it's like, it has been such a seismic shift in the landscape, going from that to the Satanic Panic to the whole, oh, that's weird. There's the strip, one of the first Dork Tower strips. The punchline is, "Hey, Marcy, come see the Satanist."
Yes.
And when I published my 1,000th online strip several years ago, I changed the punchline to where Marcy and her friend are now, playing the games themselves. And, it's Matt, who is one of the characters in Dork Tower, who is in pain because they're telling him all about their characters. So the 2000th strip is coming up actually in a few months. And so I need to rejigger that strip one more time to reflect the changes. So I've got a little time to think about that one.
John, a lot of the people listening are huge fans of Dork Tower, and like myself, have been reading since the 90s when they were in Dragon magazine. As you mentioned, there has been a huge shift in the landscape. 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons has made tabletop role-playing games so much more accessible with things like streaming online and Twitch channels dedicated to tabletop role-playing games. Folks are now trying role-playing games in Dungeons and Dragons for the very first time. And the folks who are listening, they may not have had the opportunity. So can you tell us briefly?
Sure.
About because if I tell it, I'm going to go off for like an hour. So John, can you tell them briefly what Dork Tower is about?
Sure. Dork Tower began as a gaming strip in the back of Shadis magazine, which was a publication in the 1990s when gaming and role-playing was still sort of a cult-ish kind of thing. And it chronicled 4 friends, one of whom happened to be a muskrat, who was a character I imported from my old comic strip Wildlife. So there's Matt, who is the ever-suffering game master. Yeah. There is Ken, who is the gaming encyclopedia. There is Carson, who is essentially the every muskrat, whose characters tend to get killed. And then there's Igor, who is the ultra gaming fanboy. His catchphrase is, "It must be mine." And he quickly became the most popular character in the comic strip. I actually based him on a friend of mine who was in my gaming group at the time. And if I actually said the things my Igor, Scott Ullman, did in games, people just wouldn't believe it. So I had to tone Igor down from his actual real life persona.
Wow.
And so Dork Tower ran every month, every couple of months. I believe Shadis was bi-monthly. And then it got picked up by Dragon magazine. And it ran there monthly for up until Dragon ceased its physical publication. Then it got picked up by a technology publication, I believe, Interactive Week. That was the name of the magazine. I was blanking on it for a second there. And this was a very professional, very big time magazine. And that is when Judith and I finished paying off our debts. I was getting something crazy like $500 a week for a strip. And technically there was supposed to be a rotating group of 4 cartoonists. And it's like, I just kept giving them material because it's like, if they're going to pay $500 a week for a comic strip, I'm going to write as many GD comics I can for them. And eventually I became the sole cartoonist. I don't know why these other cartoonists weren't happy with that kind of money, but it's like, here, have another strip, have another strip, have another strip. And so eventually Dork Tower became the mainstay comic in the back of that. And this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. Then 9/11 happened. And in the whole economic turmoil that occurred after that, magazines started disappearing.
Yeah.
And most of my magazines, most of the people I was working for in the 90s just went away. And that was a great shame for so many different reasons. I just like holding a magazine in my hands and looking through it in a way that, holding the iPad just doesn't quite, and swiping left to get to the next article, for me, doesn't quite hold the same literal grab. But, so I was also publishing Dork Tower online at this point. So between Dragon and Shadis and Interactive Week, I only had to do another 1 or 2 strips a week to build up an online audience. But anyway, so that is Dork Tower. And so Dork Tower gradually became, went from being just a gaming strip to, especially a role-playing strip, to including board games, including collectible card games, including just snippets of my daily life, which might be geeky, might not be geeky. Over the course of the pandemic, I've been dealing a lot with pandemic-related issues. One of the characters owns a game store. So, him having to get customers to mask up and things of that nature But it now runs thanks to a very successful Patreon. Dork Tower runs regularly 3 times a week online at dorktower.com. And thanks to a successful Kickstarter, I'm going to be putting out the first new Dork Tower collection in 15 years. So
amazing. John, we're so excited about the new Dork Tower book coming out. For those of the folks who didn't get in on the Kickstarter and weren't following it, what is the title of this new Dork Tower book?
It's called the Tao of Igor. Some people might pronounce that Tao. It's got nothing to do with the Warhammer 40K race, but it's based on the Tao of Pooh and also a movie from back in the day called the Tao of Steve. And so I took my cues from those and just had a huge amount of fun with it.
Oh, yeah, I'm so excited about it because Igor is, I think, a lot of fan favorite because he is the ultimate fanboy. And so to see this book where it's going to be about his philosophy is very exciting.
Yes, Igor is put in charge of running the local convention. So it starts off very philosophically, and this being Igor ends kind of crazily. And by the way, it was also very strange finishing off a book which is basically celebrating local conventions during the pandemic. But Igor being Igor, I don't think it's a spoiler. He always manages to land on his feet somehow.
Yes.
He makes his saving roll time and time again.
Much to Matt's amazement.
And sometimes chagrin. Yes.
And so the Kickstarter is finished and
yes,
it's funded.
It's funded.
How soon can we hope to see the book?
Okay, this is going to make it sound like I knew what I was doing because I didn't. The Kickstarter was funded and this book is coming out very late because it's been 15 years since I've done this. And I thought it was much easier. I remembered it being much easier than it was. I remember this whole process as being much, much easier than it had been 15, 20 years ago when I was putting these things out regularly. The publication date, the print date is the 15th of May. And that's, it could have been sooner than that. The book is done, but it's being printed in Canada. So there should not be any shipping delays. This is the world we now live in, the supply chain, the shipping delays. Mm-hmm. I just read of a bunch of cookbooks that washed overboard on a cargo container in the Pacific. And it's like, okay, that's one thing I don't have to worry about. But I've done enough things wrong on the Kickstarter, and my backers have been so patient and so kind and so thoughtful about it. I really do not deserve them. But anyway, it is all done. The files are finished, and it's ready to get off to the printer. And so, yes, the only delay now is the fact that, everybody and their brother and sister are scrambling to find places that will actually accept books to be published. So I'm glad the publisher I originally approached to do this still actually accepted the book at all. And it's like, okay, so that's a couple months later than it would have been, but that's fine. It's going to get done. And I'm really proud of the book as well. The last 60 pages of it, I've just thrown everything into a couple of pages in particular. There's this huge convention that's taking place, and I've got this double page spread, which is essentially like my own version of Where's Waldo. There's everything going on in this. It's been dubbed the 16 pages by the Kickstarter backers. And I'm so happy with this all. And I'm so relieved that it's all done and there's a print date. And the next couple of Kickstarters I'm going to be doing are going to be much simpler things because I've got 15 years of, a lot more actually, I believe, of Dork Tower web strips that have never been collected. I've got all of these strips I've done for this gaming magazine called Game Trade. And those are very game heavy strips. So I've got like 130 of those, which could make their own book. And at a certain point in time, I've got to start thinking about the 25th anniversary editions of the collections. I've been letting the old Dork Tower collections go out of print because I would like to do this larger 3-volume bookcase, book slip. Is that what it's called? Slipcase. I got bookcases. Every word wrong in those. It's a book slip. Sorry, the first thing. It's like, no, it's a slipcase. Anyway. But, I need a lot more experience in getting a couple of Kickstarters under my belt, which are ready as soon as the thing ends, which are ready to go to press. The backers get the PDFs the moment the campaign ends. And then I also need to get a team of people together for the giant 25th anniversary. This is not something I am going to be able to approach on my own. But one of the reasons I'm publishing again, to circle around to the point of this podcast, and remember, you said I was going to be brief about this. My apologies.
That's all right.
But a few years ago, when my daughter was 10, I saw her, she started reading through on her own my old Dork Tower collections. Oh. And she was really enjoying them. And she wanted to know if there was anything more coming. And so, yeah, it's really in a very big way, because she wanted me to start putting out more material, that this new book, which is going to be some of the old comics and about 60, 70 pages of brand new material. That's why this book is actually even being done in the first place. So
that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us, John, because it's amazing how when we share our hobby with our children, how we inspire them, but it is so incredible how unexpectedly they turn right around and inspire us. When is more coming? When can I hold a book of yours? And that's beautiful. Thank you so much. John, we're so excited about everything that's coming up. We're so excited about those future Kickstarters, the 25th anniversary, and definitely about the book that's coming out now. Now, this Dork Tower book that was kickstarted and is coming out this year. The Kickstarters, of course, will get their copies. How can folks get a copy of the book when it comes out?
Okay, so they should be able to get it through their game stores or comic book stores for a start. It should be available from the major distributors. Worst comes to worst, it'll be available from the Dork Tower store, and that's just, the website is dorktower.com. So we'll have copies there. And yeah, it's hopefully, even if it's not actually in the store at the time, it will be available from the major distributors. So it should be, not too hard to get it, I hope.
Well, John, thank you so much. I'm a huge fan. I've had Igor's at my table. I've had Ken's at my table. I feel like I've been Matt as the forever DM many times. And I think what makes the cast of Dork Tower so endearing is that they are reflections of people at all of our tables. And I'm so glad that a new generation is going to get their very own Dork Tower book to start back into it. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.